The village that waits. Imagine walking into a village that doesn't exist on any map. No birds, no dogs barking, even the wind seems to be holding its breath. The villagers smile at you, but they're hiding something. Because once every 100 years, this village needs one life to feed the old well at its center. And this time, the count landed on the exact day a young man named Bhima arrived. This is the story of a village waiting for its sacrifice, and the story of someone who had no idea he was the one they were waiting for. Part 1. Arrival in a Forgotten Land. His name was Bhima, 26 years old, a freelance photographer chasing a documentary project on remote villages deep in rural Java. Work meant for a local heritage archive. He'd spent 3 days riding down narrow dirt paths, past fields that grew emptier with every mile, until his old motorbike finally stalled in front of a leaning bamboo gate. There was no village sign, just fog. Fog so thick it clung to his skin, cold and damp, like the breath of something ancient. Bhima parked his bike on the shoulder of the road and killed the engine. That's when it hit him, the thing that made the hair on his neck stand up. The village made no sound at all. No rooster, no dog, no children playing, just his own footsteps on the wet ground and his heartbeat starting to lose its rhythm. Stilt houses lined both sides of the road, their wood blackened by decades, maybe centuries, without a single repair. Some of the roofs had caved in, and yet, strangely, a few windows still had neat curtains hanging behind the glass, as if someone still lived inside. The smell of wet earth mixed with rotting jasmine hit his nose. Sweet at first, then turning sour and bitter as it settled in his throat. He walked slowly, camera hanging from his neck, but something in him refused to raise it. Some instinct told him to stay quiet, to not make a sound, and that's when he felt it. Eyes, not one pair, many. From behind the dark windows of the stilt houses, he could feel them, one pair, two, maybe more, watching every step he took. When he spun around to look at one window, the curtain was still swaying, as if someone had just yanked it shut. Bhima swallowed hard. "Hello?" His own voice sounded foreign in that thick silence. No answer. Just his own echo bouncing back at him, strange and hollow, as if the village simply didn't allow outside voices to be heard. Part 2. Naye Kidung's Warning. At the end of the stone path, beneath an old banyan tree whose roots spread out like giant veins, an old woman sat on a large rock. Her skin was wrinkled like paper left in water too long, then dried out. Her hair, pure white, was tied back with a black wooden hairpin. But what unsettled Bhima most were her eyes, clouded like spoiled milk, and yet somehow sharp, as if she could see far more than a blind woman should ever be able to. "Boy?" Her voice was hoarse, heavy. "You're not from here." Bhima nodded stiffly. "My name's Bhima, ma'am. I'm documenting old villages around this area. Would it be all right if I stayed the night?" The old woman, whom Bhima would later know as Naye Kidung, didn't answer right away. She looked up at the sky, now bleeding into a deep purple red, like blood mixing with dusk. Then let out a long sigh that sounded like regret. "You can stay," she said finally. "But listen carefully, boy. There's one rule in this village that no one is allowed to break, not even a guest." She leaned in close and whispered, in a tone that made Bhima's skin crawl down to the bone. "Don't let your shadow touch the well water at sunset." Bhima frowned. Which well do you mean? You'll find out, Naye Kidung said, her eyes drifting toward the fog-covered center of the village. This village has its own way of welcoming guests, and that way isn't always kind. The words hung in the air, cold and unanswered, like a curse left deliberately unfinished. Bhima wanted to ask more, but Naye Kidung had already stood up, turned, and disappeared into her hut without another word. Part 3. Walking through the silence. The sun began to sink, turning the sky a strange, rusted orange. Bhima decided to look around before full dark set in, just to get a sense of the village and find somewhere decent to shelter for the night. He passed house after house that looked empty, but too tidy to actually be abandoned. On one porch sat a fresh offering of 7 kinds of flowers, as if it had been placed there only hours ago. In another house, he found a wall calendar frozen on the same year, a full century in the past, and yet the paper hadn't yellowed or crumbled at all, as if time itself had simply stopped at that exact point. His curiosity, the photographer's instinct, overpowered his fear. He raised his camera and snapped a few shots of the empty houses. But when he checked the photos on the display, his hands started shaking. In one image, a tall, shadowy figure stood faintly in a doorway behind him, even though he was certain, absolutely certain, no one had been there. He spun around. Nothing. Just fog drifting on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere, since not a single leaf on the trees was moving. From somewhere far off came a sound, not human, not animal either, more like a long groan rising from underground, as if something enormous was breathing in a depth no one could ever reach. Bhima quickened his pace, following the path toward the center of the village. And there, through the thickening fog, he saw it for the first time. The old well. Part 4. Terror at the old well. The well stood alone in the small village square, wrapped in layers of rusted iron chains, as if the people who built it had fought with everything they had to seal something inside. Black moss, unnatural in the way it grew, coated the stones, and in places there were strange carvings. Not any script Bhima recognized, more like symbols carved specifically to keep something from getting out. He stepped closer, curiosity beating out common sense. The chains creaked softly, though there was no wind to move them. Bhima leaned over the edge and peered into the well's bottomless dark. And from somewhere deep inside, a voice called his name. Bhima. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakably clear, as if it belonged to someone who knew him well, someone who had been waiting a very long time for him to come home. The hair on Bhima's arms stood on end. He stumbled back a step, his heart hammering, but his feet felt bolted to the ground, unable to run. At that same moment, the orange sky turned sharply into a deep, bloody red. His own shadow, stretched long by the dying light, began creeping toward the mouth of the well, and Bhima remembered Naye Kidung's words, "Don't let your shadow touch the well water at sunset." He leapt backward as fast as he could, an instant before the tip of his shadow touched the black water below. His breath came in ragged gasps. In the distance, he saw Naye Kidung running toward him, panic on her face, a white cloth clutched in her hand. "Move! Not here, not at sunset!" she shouted, dragging him away from the well by the arm. As she pulled him along, the old woman whispered, her voice trembling, "Those who are forgotten always find their way home." Part 5. First night, shadow on the wall. Bhima ended up hiding in an empty hut on the edge of the village. the only building whose door he could actually lock from the inside. Nayai Kidung gave him a single candle and a handful of coarse salt, telling him to line the doorway and windows with it. "Whatever happens tonight," she said before leaving, "don't blow that candle out until you hear a rooster crow." That night felt longer than any night Bhima had ever lived through. He sat pressed into a corner of the room, arms around his knees, watching the candle flames sway, even though no wind was getting in through any crack or gap. Every so often he heard footsteps outside, slow, heavy, like something wet being dragged across the ground. Around midnight, the candle flickered 3 times and went out. Darkness swallowed the room whole. Bhima held his breath, fumbling blindly for a match, but his hand froze when he saw it. On the bamboo wall directly across from him, a long shadow starting to take shape. Not a human shadow. It stretched unnaturally, its fingers ending in curved, sharp claws, crawling slowly down from the ceiling toward the floor, as if the thing were pulling itself out of the wall itself. Bhima pressed himself deeper into the corner, clamping a hand over his own mouth to keep any sound from escaping. The shadow crept closer, its claws scraping the wall in slow, deliberate strokes, leaving long gouges that screeched like nails dragged across glass. He could hear breathing, heavy, wet, like someone forcing air through a throat clogged with mud. The breathing got closer and closer to his neck, and right as the claw was about to touch his shoulder, from somewhere far off came the sound of a rooster crowing, the only animal sound Bhima had heard since setting foot in that village. The shadow on the wall vanished instantly, as if yanked back into the wood itself. Bhima collapsed to the floor, his whole body shaking, cold sweat soaking through his back. Part 6. The truth kept hidden. Morning came, the fog still heavy, though not as thick as the night before. Bhima forced himself up and went looking for Nayai Kidung, desperate for answers to everything that happened. Inside the old woman's hut, he found something that made every piece click into place. A worn notebook full of names, handwritten in fading ink, one name for every 100 years. Nayai Kidung stepped out from behind a curtain, unsurprised to find Bhima holding the book. "This village existed before this country even had a name," she said quietly, lowering herself into her old wooden chair. "Long ago, our ancestors made a pact with something that lives beneath the ground. To keep this village fertile, safe from disaster. But that pact came with a price. A sacrifice," Bhima murmured, his voice shaking. Nayai Kidung nodded slowly. "One life, every 100 years, and that well is the door." Bhima stared at the book, running his finger down the list of names. The last one written there, in ink that looked freshly inked despite 100 years supposedly having passed, was his own. Bhima. His hands shook violently, and the book slipped from his grip. Why is my name already in here?" Nayai Kidung looked at him, her clouded eyes wet with tears that never quite fell. "Because that well chose you the moment you walked through this village's gate yesterday, boy, and no one has ever been able to refuse its choice." Part 7. Last night, the village's sacrifice. The second night fell faster than it should have, as if time itself were rushing to finish something long overdue. Bhima tried to run, sprinting for the bamboo gate where his bike was parked. But the thick fog acted like a living wall, steering him back toward the center of the village, no matter which direction he ran. In the square, Nayai Kidung already stood before the well, eyes closed, her lips trembling through an ancient chant in a language Bhima didn't recognize. Heavy, insistent, like a spell spoken thousands of times before by mouths long since gone silent. The iron chains wrapped around the well began to groan, then snapped one by one, the sound of breaking metal ringing out and shattering the night's silence. Thick black water surged up from inside the well, spilling outward in every direction like spreading blood, carrying a stench so foul it doubled Bhima over in a coughing fit. "Nayai! Please, stop this!" Bhima screamed, but the old woman only looked at him, her eyes now brimming with tears, without breaking her chant for even a second. This was no longer about what Nayai Kidung wanted. It was an obligation binding the entire village for hundreds of years. A burden she had to carry through, no matter how much it broke her. Bhima turned to run again, away from the well, but the ground beneath his feet suddenly softened, turning to living mud. Out of the earth rose the same clawed, elongated shadows he'd seen on the hut wall the night before. Only now there were dozens, crawling up out of the cracked ground, wrapping around his ankles and wrists with a strength no human body could match. "Ah!" he screamed, grabbing at anything within reach, but nothing could stop the pull. The shadows dragged him, inch by inch, toward the well's mouth, now gaping wide like a hungry, giant maw. The same voice from the night before returned, closer now, clearer, as if it were speaking directly into his ear. "Bhima, come home." In the final second before his body was pulled entirely into the well's darkness, Bhima looked at Nayai Kidung one last time. The old woman squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her wrinkled face, but her mouth never stopped chanting until Bhima's voice was completely swallowed by the black water. Then everything went silent. Party 8. Aftermath. The next morning the sun rose warm and clear, as if the village had just woken from a long nightmare. The fog that had blanketed everything since Bhima's arrival was completely gone, as if it had never existed at all. Roosters crowed back and forth. Children's laughter drifted in from somewhere in the distance. For a moment, the village felt alive again. Nayai Kidung walked slowly toward the square, a straw broom in her hand, sweeping the dry leaves around the well the same way she probably had every morning for decades. New chains gleaming, freshly forged, already wrapped around the well, sealing back whatever was meant to sleep for another 100 years. Nothing of Bhima remained. No trace, no body, not a single word of goodbye. Just a backpack lying at the edge of the square, slowly disappearing under a layer of dust carried by the morning wind. As if time itself were quietly working to erase him from memory. Nayai Kidung paused in front of the bag for a moment. She looked at it for a long while, then went back to sweeping, as if this wasn't the first time she'd done this, and somehow it wouldn't be the last. Because somewhere out there, 100 years from now, one more name will be written in that notebook, waiting for someone who has no idea that they were already chosen the moment they set foot in that quiet, forgotten village.